Good morning, everybody. We are back to learn more about the 13 colonies, and we have a crazy busy week because next week is map testing. So let's just jump right in without a lot of preamble. We are currently on chapter 10 in the 13 colonies readers. If you're following along with that, the PDF is in Bright Thinker if you want to follow along. But before we do that, we're going to read a little bit about Plymouth. We are talking about a different colony in Massachusetts. We are not talking about Jamestown. We are now talking about Plymouth. According to the legend, the Pilgrims set foot in North America on Plymouth Rock, a large granite boulder on the shore at Plymouth. Today, the rock is enclosed to keep people from climbing on it. Although no reliable evidence exists to support the landing on Plymouth Rock, the story has become part of our national lore. The Pilgrims called their settlement Plymouth Colony in honor of the English town from which they had recently set sail. With little food, no way to plant and grow food in the winter, and only temporary shelter, almost half the colonists died that first winter. Bradford noted in 2 or 3 months' time, half the company died, especially in January and February, wanting houses and being infected with scurvy and other diseases. They died sometimes 2 or 3 a day. Scurvy is a disease that you get if you don't have fresh fruits and vegetables. It's a lack of vitamin C. In spring 1621, the Wampanoag, under Chief Massasoit, came to the aid of the Pilgrims. A Native American named Samoset visited them and spoke in broken English. Samoset told them of another Native American named Tisquantoon or Squanto, who had been to England and spoke even better English than Samoset. Squanto's story is remarkable. He had been kidnapped by an English explorer years earlier and had spent time in Spain and England. Later, he had returned to America only to find that his original people, the Potoics, had died of diseases brought by the Europeans. Squanto joined the Wampanoag and eventually, and Chief Massasoit. When the Pilgrims arrived, he presented himself as a translator, and eventually he became an agricultural advisor as well. Squanto proved especially helpful to the Pilgrims. He made a peace treaty between the Native Americans and the colonists, and he taught the colonists how to raise corn, beans, and squash. Those sound familiar? The Three Sisters? We talked about those earlier. He also showed them which wild plants were safe to gather and eat. The Pilgrims learned quickly in their harvest that fall was good enough to provide food for the coming winter. So they set aside time to give thanks to God. William Bradford records many other interesting details about the Pilgrims in his history. One of the most fascinating stories tells how the Pilgrims first adopted and then later rejected a communal style of farming. Communal means everybody pitches in. The original plan was for all the Pilgrims to hold the land jointly and to all share the fruits of the soil. This was called the common course and condition, and it was tried for a few years. But Bradford noted that the system was problematic. The young men that were the most able to work the fields resented that they should spend all of their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children's without any profit to themselves. To alleviate the confusion and the dissent, Bradford and the other Pilgrim leaders decided to assign each head of household some land and a certain amount of seed and let them all farm for themselves. Bradford says this greatly improved the situation. Bradford was governor of the colony at the time that this happened. He was reelected 30 times. That's a lot. Over the next several decades. The colony he governed was very religious. All men, women, and children were expected to attend church. All right, that's our little bit about the Pilgrims. Remember what we discussed in the previous chapter? We discussed that the Pilgrims were called separatists. They wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England. They moved to America for religious freedoms. That is the sole reason that they moved to America. Some people say, oh, they were just coming here for land. Nope. The only reason they came to America was for religious reasons. The colony of Plymouth was founded on religious freedom. That's why they came to America. They sailed here on the Mayflower, and original intention was to land in Virginia, but because of the storms, they ended up north of Virginia in Massachusetts. Before they left before they left the ship, all of the men had to sign the Mayflower Compact to govern the colony. And if you remember, the Mayflower Compact was an agreement that they would all work together to govern the colony. Okay, let's go ahead and move on into our reader. We are on page 62, and that's not what I have marked. Crazy. All right, here we go. Chapter 10, Plymouth, the Pilgrim Colony. The first section is entitled A Harsh Winter. The Pilgrims had hoped to settle in Virginia, but the captain of the Mayflower had refused to go any farther than Cape Cod. The cold, snowy days of winter had already begun. The Pilgrims spent most of their first winter in Plymouth Colony aboard the crowded, damp Mayflower. The men and the boys went ashore to build the first houses. An icy wind blew off the ocean, and on many days the weather was so bad that the men could not work. During that first winter, half of the Pilgrims died from cold and from hunger. All winter, the Native Americans who lived near Plymouth stayed in the forest and watched the Pilgrims. They watched the Pilgrims bring supplies from the ship. They watched them chop down trees and saw logs into planks to build houses. The first house the Pilgrims built was called the Common House. And this was a building that was used for meetings and for worship. And it was always in every colony, in every settlement that the Pilgrims settled, the first building that they built was a common house. At first, it was used as shelter and a place to store the tools. Later, it was used as a place of worship. When spring finally came, the Pilgrims moved off the Mayflower and into their houses. They began to plant crops. They had to work hard. Once the Mayflower sailed back to England, they were on their own. During the warm summer, the Pilgrims tended their gardens. They were already preparing for the winter ahead. Remember, they had Jamestown to look back on and the starving time of Jamestown. None of the colonies that were set up after Jamestown were interested in experiencing their own starving time. Everybody was very concerned about having enough food and enough wood set aside so that when winter came, they would not have starving time like they had in Jamestown. One day, a tall Native American warrior with long black hair appeared at the edge of the woods. He walked boldly into Plymouth. The Pilgrims came out of their houses and the fields to see the visitors. "Welcome, Englishmen," he said. "My name is Samoset." The Pilgrims were astonished that he spoke English. It turned out that Samoset had learned the Pilgrims' language from the English fishermen who dried their nets and packed their fish along the shore. Samoset spoke to John Carver. John Carver was the first governor of Plymouth. He told the governor that the chief of the Wampanoag was coming to visit the Pilgrims. The Wampanoag lived nearby. Samoset told the Pilgrims about the Native Americans who used to live in the place where the Pilgrims had built their village. These Native Americans had cleared the fields around Plymouth, and a few years before, Samoset told the Pilgrims a strange sickness had killed every member of the nation. We now know that it was diseases brought over by the Englishmen to which the Native Americans had had no natural exposure, which means that when they were exposed to it, many of them died. And in fact, the entire tribe of Squanto's tribe was wiped out, and it was probably smallpox or measles or um, I'm thinking cowpox. I don't know why, but it was probably it was probably measles or smallpox, which were very common in Europe, and most people had a natural immunity to, because as you're allowed to be exposed to it, your body develops natural antibodies and you become naturally immune to it. Whereas if you're never exposed to it, then once the first time that you are exposed in a large dose, you typically catch the disease, and it was had a fairly high fatality rate. Okay. A few years before, Samoset told the Pilgrims a strange sickness had killed every member of that nation. The only person left in the nation was Squanto, a warrior. Squanto had been taken to England by fishermen before the strange sickness broke out. When Squanto returned, he was the only one of his people still alive. A few days later, Samoset brought the chief of the Wampanoag to Plymouth Colony. With him were several warriors, including Squanto. The Pilgrims and the Native Americans exchanged gifts. They ate and they drank together. Afterwards, Governor Carver and the chief made a peace treaty that lasted 54 years. 54, that's a long time for a peace treaty. Longer than the treaty between Pocahontas' tribe and the colonists in Jamestown. The chief and the other Native Americans left, but Squanto stayed behind to live with the Pilgrims. He showed the Pilgrims where to fish, and he pointed out which nuts and berries were safe to eat. Oh, that is the next page. The Pilgrims were very busy that first spring. Both the boys and the girls gathered mussels from the rocks in the shallow water at the edge of the sea. A mussel is a um, shellfish. It grows in a smooth shell, and it's kind of like a clam or an oyster. And you open up the shell and you take it out of the inside, and you can eat it. They dug clams from the wet sand, and clams are similar to mussels. They carried water and wood, and they stuffed linen sacks with corn husks to make mattresses. They didn't have any memory foam back then. In the late spring, Governor Carver died. The Pilgrims chose William Bradford as their new governor. Bradford was the governor of Plymouth for the next 35 years. Remember, he was reelected 30 times. That's so many. He even wrote a history of the colony that people today still study. In the fall, Governor Bradford gathered all of the Pilgrims together, and he told them that they had many things to be thankful for. They had finally found a place to worship God in their own way. And thanks to their Native American friends, their harvest would be plentiful. If they were careful, no one would go hungry during the next winter. Now, harvest, we've already learned this term. We learned it when we were reading Farmer Boy. It is the crops that are collected at the end of a growing season. That's basically what a harvest is. To celebrate, Governor Bradford invited the Pilgrims' Native American friends to feast with them, and he offered prayers of thanksgiving. The feast lasted 3 days. Most of us don't celebrate Thanksgiving for 3 days, um, although some people do. I know my family, everybody comes to my mom's house, which is close to here, and they typically arrive on Wednesday evening, the day before Thanksgiving. And most everybody leaves on Thursday afternoon. I mean, not Thursday, Sunday afternoon. So our family kind of celebrates it Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So we somewhat celebrate for 3 days, but we don't celebrate like the Pilgrims did. I can guarantee you that. The feast was a Thanksgiving celebration that has become an American tradition. We do not know for certain whether they ate turkey, but Governor Bradford did write that they had fowl, which are birds, for dinner as well as other kinds of meats. So maybe they had wild turkey. Maybe they had wild geese. Maybe they had chickens. When we celebrate Thanksgiving today, also they could have had pheasant or quail, even. Those are all wild. When we celebrate Thanksgiving today, we remember how the Pilgrims came to the Americas in search of religious freedom, how much they had to suffer, and how grateful they were for their new life. We also think about the Native Americans who helped them and who shared in their celebration. Okay, let me set that aside. Now, get my other book. Where did I put my other book? See, we have a lot to prepare. Okay, the first question. There we go. There's my questions. How did the Pilgrims' first winter in Plymouth compare to the first winter experienced by the other colonists in Virginia, by the first colonists in Virginia? Just like the colonists in Virginia, the Pilgrims experienced a harsh and a very cold winter, and many Pilgrims died. However, during the winter, they were able to continue to live on the Mayflower. So, as a smaller percentage actually died. So they had shelter, unlike some of the others. What did the Pilgrims build first, and what was it used for? They built a common house, that's right. Initially, it was used to store tools and other equipment, but eventually it became their place of worship or their church or synagogue or mosque, like a mosque, or I can't even think of the other words. It was a church, basically. It was their place of worship, their church. Who was Samoset and what did he tell the pilgrims? Samoset was a Native American and he was a Native American warrior and he spoke very good English and he had learned it from the fishermen who cleaned their nets along the shore. He had just listened in and he had learned it. He used Samoset. Yes, Samoset. That's who we're talking about. He used to live in the no, that's Squanto. I'm sorry. Samoset was the second Native American who came, and that seems wrong. Samoset was the first one, and he did. Yes, so I was right the first time. He learned English from the fishermen that cleaned their nets along the shores, and he was one of the Native Americans who used to live in the area of Plymouth that the Native Americans in that area had died of a strange sickness. How was Squanto able to communicate with the Pilgrims? Squanto. Yes, he was the one who was kidnapped by English by fishermen, and he was taken to England, and so he learned to speak English in England, and that's how he was able to communicate with the Pilgrims. How did Squanto help the Pilgrims? He did. He taught them how to fish and to grow food better. He also taught them which nuts and berries were safe to eat, and he helped them trade with the other Native Americans. And who was William Bradford? He was the second governor of the colony of Plymouth, and he was the governor for 35 years. He was reelected 30 times, and he was also the colony's historian, shall we say. He was the one who wrote about the history of Plymouth Colony. What did the Pilgrims give thanks for at their first Thanksgiving? Well, there were several things that they gave thanks for. One of the things that they gave thanks for is that they were able to come to the country, come to America, where they were able to worship God. They had religious freedom. That was the main thing that they gave thanks for. The other thing that they gave thanks for was their Native American friends who helped them so that they did not have their own starving time, so they did not starve. How does the Pilgrims' Thanksgiving compare to the Thanksgiving as we celebrate it today? It's a little bit different. They celebrated for 3 days. Most of us just celebrate for one day. Although both celebrations are meant that the reason that we have these, they're meant to express thankfulness for what we have. Their celebration, like I said, was several days, where ours just is usually just one day, and they may or may not have eaten turkey. Almost everybody eats turkey on Thanksgiving. My family loves turkey. We eat it more than just Thanksgiving, but Thanksgiving is a big turkey day for us. They had all kinds of different sorts of foods. Many of us have some of the same foods: potatoes and corn and beans and squash. Those are all things that the pilgrims did eat, and those are things that we tend to eat. Probably they had some sort of wild berries. We tend to eat cranberries, so that's another way that they're very similar. All righty. Why was it important for the pilgrims to work hard to prepare for winter? Mhm. They needed to work very hard to prepare for the winter so that they could survive, so they wouldn't have their starving time. Remember, they had Jamestown Colony to look back on, and they remember how bad that it was. They wanted to be sure that they had the food and the shelter that they would need to get them through the cold winter months so they wouldn't starve and freeze to death. Okay, um, we're going to do a little bit more reading. I told you it was a really busy week. So now we're going to pull out our What Your Third Grader Needs to Know. And if you have this book, we are going to be on page 149. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. That's what we're reading. Imagine you are a pilgrim child, one of the lucky ones who made it through the first winter. It is a blustery March day, and the leaves had not yet returned to the trees. You're hungry, and there's very little to eat. Sometimes you see faces in the forest. You look, they look, and then they dart away. What are they thinking? What are they planning? Will they attack? Then you hear a deep voice. Welcome, Englishmen. A man dressed in deerskin walks boldly into your camp. You can hardly believe your ears. An Indian that speaks English? Everyone gathers around. The man says his name is Samoset. He says he knows another who speaks English even better than he. Your governor gives him presents, and Samoset promises to return. Days later, he comes back and he brings more Indians with him. He introduces you to Tisquantum, who speaks English very well. Over time, Tisquantum teaches you and the other pilgrims how to plant corn. Remember, we know him as Squanto. How to plant corn, pumpkins, and beans. He shows you good places to fish. He guides you through the lands around Plymouth. He introduces your leaders to Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag tribe. Soon, the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims sign a treaty of peace and friendship that will last many years. Do you remember how long it was? Yes, 54 years. 54 years. The Pilgrims took to Colin to Squantum by the name Squanto. Years before they arrived, Squanto had been kidnapped by traders. He was taken first to Spain and then to England, where he learned to speak English. A London merchant helped him back to America on an English fishing ship. But on his return, he found that all of his people had been killed by chickenpox. Oh, I said cowpox, didn't I? Chickenpox. Oopsie. Which some historians think was brought by the English settlers. Squanto found a home with Massasoit and the Wampanoag people nearby. He was a good friend and a great help to the Pilgrims. During the spring and summer of 1621, the Pilgrims built homes near the ocean shore. Following Squanto's advice, they raised good crops. With William Bradford as their new governor, the Pilgrims decided to celebrate with a harvest festival. They invited their Wampanoag friends to a 3-day celebration. Bradford sent fishermen and hunters to bring back food. Massasoit, with 90 of his men, hunted in the forest and brought 5 deer. For 3 days, the Indians and Pilgrims feasted on goose, duck, turkey, venison, cod, bass, stewed pumpkin, cornbread, wild onions, custard, and fruit tarts. The English danced jigs and sang the 23rd Psalm. The Indians chanted hymns and danced in ways that made the stone necklaces on their chests bounce. For these 3 days in the fall of 1621, they gathered in peace and in friendship. We remember this gathering as the first Thanksgiving. Oops, gotta mark that page, move that book. But wait, we're not done. I told you it was a busy day. We are now going to add to our interactive notebook. So get your interactive notebook out. I am probably going to start a new page, I think. We are still talking about Massachusetts because remember we have Plymouth. Let me open my, uh-oh, is it glued? I thought my notebook was glued together. Okay, so if we look here at your map, this is a map. Here is the Jamestown colony, and here was the Plymouth colony. See how far off course that they were? And that star, that's Boston, Massachusetts. Boston and Salem were only about 20 miles apart. And we're going to learn about that next week, I think, is when we start talking about that some more. Okay, let's go ahead and take notes in our interactive notebook. Make sure you start with your heading, which is your name. And the date, today's date is 5/3. We are already into May, guys. We're almost done with the school year. And the lesson is chapter 10. All right. Our first heading is Pilgrims. Pilgrims. And that's spelled pill, Pilgrims. First bullet point. We only have 2 bullet points under Pilgrims. Half died the first winter. Say it. Half died the first winter. Say it. Half died the first winter. Remember, this is before they met the Wampanoags. Half died. This is when the Indians were still watching, the Native Americans, I'm sorry, were still watching them through the forest. Half died the first winter. They didn't come out to help them until March or April after that first winter. Wampanoag helped them survive. Say it. Wampanoag helped them survive. Say it. Wampanoag helped them survive. Say it as you write it down. And this is spelled Wham, Pan, O, Ag. Wampam, Wampam, O, Ag. Nothing like it. We say it. Now I can't even say it right. Wampanoag. Helped them survive. Helped them survive. All right, our second heading is Squanto. And that's spelled never use Q without U. Anto. Squanto. Squanto. Spoke English. Say it. Spoke English. Spoke English. Say it as you're writing it down. Spoke English. Okay, our second bullet point. Taught pilgrims to fish and grow food well. Say it. Taught pilgrims to fish and grow food well. Say it. Taught pilgrims to fish and grow food well. Say it as you're writing it down. Taught pilgrims to fish and grow food well. Grow food well, or better, or however you want to put it there. Next bullet point. Taught them which nuts and berries were safe to eat. Say it. Taught them which nuts and berries were safe to eat. Say it. Taught them which nuts and berries were safe to eat. Say it as you're writing it down. Taught them which nuts and berries were safe. I'm just going to put safe because otherwise I have to start a new line. Safe to eat. We know that means safe to eat. Help them trade with other Native Americans. Say it. Help them trade with other Native Americans. Say it. Help them trade with other Native Americans. Say it as you're writing it down. Helped them trade with other Native Americans. And I abbreviate Native Americans NA in my notes. I know what that means. Okay, our next heading is William Bradford. Bradford. That's how you spell his name. William Bradford. And the first bullet point, second governor of Plymouth. Say it. Second governor of Plymouth. Say it. Second governor of Plymouth. Say it as you write it down. Second governor, governor of Plymouth. And then next to that, in brackets, brackets. I'm going to put after John Carver. Because remember, he was the first governor, but then he died. John Carver. Okay, second bullet point. Served 35 years. Say it. Served 35 years. Say it. served 35 years. And whenever we hear about the colony of Plymouth, we typically don't hear about John Carver because he died so soon after they were there. When we hear about the colony of Plymouth, we typically hear about its leader being John Bradford because he was the leader for such an extended period of time. And then our last bullet point is, I'm not bullet point, heading, harvest feast. Harvest feast. And what do we know this as? That's right, Thanksgiving. Put that in brackets. Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. They called it a harvest feast. We call it Thanksgiving. Lasted several days. Say it. Lasted several days. Say it. Lasted several days. Say it as you write it down. Lasted several days. Next bullet point. Wampanoag and Pilgrims celebrated together. Say it. Wampanoag and Pilgrims celebrated together. Say it. Wampanoag and Pilgrims celebrated together. Say it as you're writing it down. Remember, Wampanoag is Wham, Pan, O, Ag. Wampanoag and Pilgrims celebrated together. It's getting warm in here. Called First Thanksgiving. Say it. Called First Thanksgiving. Say it. Called First Thanksgiving. Say it as you're writing it down. Called First Thanksgiving. And guys, remember, if you ever need to pause the video during your notes, if I'm talking too fast, pause it. I want to make sure you get the notes. Listen to what I'm saying, pause it while you write it down, restart it, pause it, restart it, pause it. You can do that. It's not a big deal. Okay, our first vocabulary is common house. Common, 2 words, house. Common house. Oh, excuse me. A building used for meetings and worship. Say it. I have the hiccups. A building used for meetings and worship. Say it. A building used for meetings and worship. Say it as you're writing it down. A building used for meetings and worship. Sorry, I had to get rid of my hiccups. And then our second vocabulary word is harvest. We already know this one. You shouldn't have any trouble with it. The crops collected at the end of a growing season. Say it. The crops collected at the end of a growing season. Say it. The crops collected at the end of a growing season. Say it as you're writing it down. The crops collected at the end of a growing season. Okay, I think that's the last one. It is, yay! That's all the notes for today. Tomorrow we'll be back with chapter 11, and we'll talk about the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the other colony that settled in Massachusetts. This one settled in Plymouth Colony. The other one settled near Salem and Boston, and it was called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And eventually those two were combined to kind of make up that general area. All right, you guys have a great day. We'll be back tomorrow with chapter 11. Bye-bye.